Perfect. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Othan Alexandrakis. I'm an associate professor and chair of the Department of Anthropology. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to our department's annual lecture. Before we begin, I'd like to invite the president of our department's undergraduate student association, Maria Capoletti, to read the land acknowledgement, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. So I'm going to read the University line acknowledgement, but I want everyone to know that since we are institutional Zoom, we're going to read in different lands, so do your own little land acknowledgement as well. So York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been taken care of by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders that the Mississaugas of the Great First Nation. This territory is subject to the Ditchwood-Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. Thank you so much. I'll put a link in the chat for nativeslands.ca so you can see exactly which Indigenous territory you're on right now.
That's great. Thank you, Maria. As part of our commitment to decolonization, the Department of Anthropology has committed to engaging with and supporting the work of Indigenous scholars, activists, artists, land defenders, and water keepers, to remaining accountable to the ways that colonialism and white supremacy continue to inform institutions of higher learning and the privileging of colonial ways of knowing, and to unsettling how the discipline of anthropology continues to benefit from extractive forms of knowledge that maintain colonial forms of power. Among our various decolonizing initiatives, colleagues at the department have established 2 major awards in support of Indigenous and Black students. You can learn more about these awards, and you may make a donation by following the link in the chat, which I'm adding now. The annual lecture is a marquee event of the Department of Anthropology. Past speakers have included eminent leaders in the field, including Anna Singh, Elizabeth Pavanelli, Hugh Raffles, Karen Ho, Audra Simpson, and Ann Stoller. With the support of York's Founders College, the Center for Refugee Studies, and the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, we continue this tradition today. Once again, welcome everyone to the annual lecture. I would now like to invite the Dean of our faculty, J.J. McMurtry, to say a few words before turning it over to my colleague, Professor David Murray, to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Othan, and thank you, Maria, for the land acknowledgement. And good afternoon, everybody. I really am thrilled to be with you all today. It's an exciting event, and it's so wonderful to see so many people, almost 100 participants here. It's really great during a pandemic that we can get this many people out. So on behalf of the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, I want to welcome Professor Jason de Leon to York University, if only virtually. I'm so pleased that you're with us today, Dr. Leon. These are incredibly important events for the university and for the faculty. The ideas that get exchanged, the knowledge and information sharing with international colleagues as well as national colleagues helps us to grow and nurture and nourish new research. So it's really critical that we're having these events, and thank you again for being with us, because as COVID has taught us, these events can be fleeting, and so many opportunities have been lost over the last number of years for all of us to exchange ideas. So it's great to see us all gathering here today and in great numbers to experience these types of events again. On a personal note, I'm just booked to go to my first conference in almost 3 years, and I'm so excited to be with colleagues again in the spring. So about this event, York is really fortunate to have such a diverse and vibrant anthropology program. This annual lecture has been mentioned as a marquee event for students, staff, faculty, and the community as a whole. And many thanks go out to all the organizers who continue to bring thoughtful and timely talks to the university. And during a pandemic, again, I hate to mention it all the time, but really it's extra labor, it's volunteer labor, and it's really important. So thank you so much for putting that effort in. So today's lecture, I think, is really very timely because we are all witnessing, of course, a new refugee crisis, as well as the existing ones that haunt us already. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians, if not millions, are leaving Ukraine to flee the country. And we're seeing attention to these types of topics being broadcast around the world and being discussed in various areas. So today's discussion about migration, border enforcement, and the subsequent violence endured by migrants is critical. And these conversations, of course, give us a front row seat into leading discussions right here in the Department of Anthropology of real world problems and investigations into those problems. And I'm sure what's discussed today will lead to ongoing and complex discussions for many weeks to come, months, hopefully, in the department, amongst colleagues and amongst the community. So thank you again, everybody, so much for attending today. I really look forward to seeing part of it. I apologize, I have to leave in a little bit, but I really look forward to this talk, and thank you all for attending. So I'll turn it over to David now. Thanks.
Thank you, Dean McMurtry. Thank you, Athan and Maria. Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure now to introduce our speaker. And Professor Jason De Leon is Professor of Anthropology and Chicano and Central American Studies at UCLA. He is also Executive Director of the Undocumented Migration Project, a research arts education collective that seeks to document and raise awareness about the experiences of clandestine migrants. And he is President of the Board of Directors for the Colibri Center for Human Rights, a nonprofit organization that seeks to identify and repatriate the remains of people who have died while migrating through the Sonoran Desert of Arizona. Professor De Leon is the author of the award-winning book, The Land of Open Graves, Living and Dying on the Migrant Trail, and is a 2017 MacArthur Fellow. He is currently working on a book project called Soldiers and Kings, an ethnography of the lives of Honduran smugglers crossing Mexico. And just before I turn it over to Professor De Leon, just to remind everyone, there will be a Q&A session at the end of the talk today. That's being organized through the Q&A window feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can post a question through Q&A. Because it's a really large group, we've decided that that's the best way to make sure we see all the questions rather than trying to navigate with people putting their hands up. So just post your question. We will try to get through as many as we can before 6 p.m. and I'll moderate that after and I'll read the questions to Dr. De Leon. So without further ado, over to you, Dr. De Leon.
Thank you so much for having me. And it feels like every time I do one of these things, I sat in a Zoom talk maybe 2 months ago and the person said, I'm going to share my Zoom screen now, but I'm not going to say I'm going to share my Zoom screen. And so I've been working on trying to share my Zoom screen without actually falling into that trap. But it didn't work again, but that's totally fine. I'm just really excited to be here. I'm sorry that that I couldn't be there in person. Let me just make sure that you are saying correctly everything that you should be saying, except not that. Okay, does that look good? Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm sad that I can't be there in person, but it's really just great to have this cross-border dialogue about these issues. As someone who was at the University of Michigan for many, many years, and thinking a lot about border issues between Canada and the United States and the similarities and differences with what's happening along the U.S.-Mexico border, it's just always, I think, important to have these types of conversations. And especially right now, as Dean McMurtry mentioned, we're in a moment right now where a refugee crisis that's happening in Europe is incredibly visible, and yet at the same time there are these other refugee crises that have been happening for a very long time that come in and out of public view, including what's going on in Central America, and I bring this up because there was a New York Times article last week about this spike since June of last year of Russians and Ukrainians crossing the U.S.-Mexico border and asking for asylum. The statistic was something like 2/3 of those asylum cases have been approved. It's a relatively small number compared to people coming from Latin America, but most people from Latin America who apply for asylum number one, are forced to wait in Mexico while their cases are being heard. The United States has been letting in Ukrainians and Russians while they await those asylum hearings, and then has also been approving 2/3 of those cases. And so, despite the fact that we've got multiple refugee crises happening right now, there's very much this lens, I think, of race and discrimination and other things that are impacting sort of who qualifies as an acceptable refugee and who doesn't. I mean, and obviously this is not meant to to say anything bad about what's happening in Ukraine. Of course, I think everybody's really feeling for folks there, especially the civilian casualties. But I just think it could also be an important moment for us to begin to look around and say, well, who are these other refugees globally that we need to be, treating with care and with dignity, and trying to, as first world nations, trying to help alleviate the suffering that they are experiencing. That also being said, I think that the United States has done an incredibly poor job of assisting refugees and migrants, especially in the wake of a recent presidential shift away from the Trump administration towards Biden's administration, where many Americans were promised a new and kinder, more gentler kind of American immigration system, and yet, much like the Who song, meet the new boss, same as the old, where many of the things that we were promised were going to change have continued to stay the same. And I think for me, part of it is oftentimes just the general tone deafness that the American public and especially the American government has about immigration issues. Vice President Kamala Harris last year went to Central America for her first visit there as vice president. And one of the things that she said to a room full of reporters in Guatemala was, "Do not come to the United States." And soon after that press conference, I was asked by a reporter from England, who said, "What do you think about what the vice president said?" And my response was, if that worked, we would have said that a long time ago, right? But it's just we're just putting these shallow statements out into the world about immigration and about the way that things are and how we think we can solve these problems. And I think it's just really problematic. And I think it's also indicative of a much longer history of American historical amnesia, as well as just a refusal to understand or to acknowledge that things are bad in a lot of these places. And when we tell people to not come from to not leave Central America and come to the United States, I think what a lot of folks don't understand too is that those countries are becoming increasingly unlivable, much like many other parts of the world. And these things are linked to climate change. There's an increasingly direct correlation between the impacts of climate change and the creation of refugees. And so we can look just to Honduras in the last 16 months to see how, back-to-back super hurricanes have devastated that country and made it unlivable for so many who have had to flee because there are no jobs, because their homes have been destroyed, because their economy's been shut down by COVID, but also because they're living in some of the most violent countries in the Western Hemisphere. And so when we tell people, don't come to the United States, stay where you are, people in places like Honduras and El Salvador are living with unbelievably high homicide rates that, people will say to you, I would rather die in the Sonoran Desert of Arizona than be shot on a street corner in San Pedro Sula by a stranger, because at least in the Sonora Desert, I've taken my own life into my own hands, and there's also the potential of improving my situation. So I think we just need to be thinking more about the connection between this migration crisis, political instability, poverty, and now increasingly things like warfare as helping to fuel this growing global migration crisis that the next generation is really going to have to deal with in much better ways than my generation and those previously have done. So I want to just kind of I wanted to set that up as just a kind of a precursor to what we're going to talk about in Arizona. So we can kind of bring that into the into the Q&A. What I'm going to talk about today comes from my first book project, The Land of Open Graves, which is largely about what's going on in the Arizona desert. I've just completed a book, as was mentioned, on Honduran smugglers. And so looking at how human smuggling has evolved post-2015 and what that looks like in relationship to transnational gangs, climate change, and a whole host of other things. So I'm happy to connect the dots in the Q&A as well. But I think it's important, today to really understand what's happening along the U.S.-Mexico border, because it is the most sort of famous border in the Western Hemisphere, if not in the world. It's a border where many other countries are taking cues from in terms of how to manage immigration security, for good or for bad, and I would argue for bad. So I think it's important for us to understand that history, because it does extend, and I will talk about how it extends into Mexico and elsewhere throughout this talk. But we're gonna get a little bit of a history lesson about this policy called prevention through deterrence. I'm going to talk about the violence that migrants experience and the fatalities that are happening on a daily basis, and I'll do that by telling some stories about individuals who have unfortunately lost their lives along the border. And if you can take away anything from this talk, it's number one, America has been talking about border walls for the last 5 or 6 years. More so than they have in a really long time. And what I want to argue is that, border walls are smokescreens, and the desert that we have in places like southern Arizona are in fact a giant border wall that's been existing and brutalizing people for a very long time. I also want to argue that the deaths that happen along that geopolitical boundary are not collateral damage. It's not unintended consequences, but these are the direct results of policies designed to kill people. And then finally, I want to make this argument that the violence that happens at the U.S.-Mexico border extends far beyond that. It extends into Latin America. It extends into the United States and much farther. And the things that happen there really are long lasting and part of a much larger, I think, global problem around border security. And so, just as a warning, there will be a couple of images around migrant death that might be a bit troubling, but I think it's important to look at these things head on. And to try to not whitewash the realities that people are experiencing on a daily basis. The work that I'm going to talk about today comes from the Undocumented Migration Project, which is a research, arts, and education collective that I've directed since 2009. It's basically it's a whole bunch of different research approaches that I've stolen either from within my own discipline of anthropology or co-opted from others, and tried to combine in different sorts of ways in an attempt to better understand what's happening along the migrant trail. And this involves, ethnography, archaeology, forensic science, and you'll see a little bit of this stuff today. But it's also a significant amount of exhibition work and other various outreach components, including the work that we do now with an organization called the Colibri Center for Human Rights, which is a Tucson-based nonprofit that works with families of the missing. We work to take DNA collections from families so that we can match them to recovered human remains as well as missing persons reports. And we are the Undocumented Migration Project is currently in the process of legally absorbing Colibri, and so. We joined up in the fall, and then we're going through the paperwork right now to be legally linked, and then basically, I've been directing the Colibri Center now for about 7 months, and then also directing the Undocumented Migration Project. And so we're hoping that by the legal merging, it'll mean one less board meeting I have to go to, and a whole bunch of other streamlined sorts of things. But if you're interested in learning more about our work, I would encourage you to check out our websites where you can read all about our different initiatives. And I'll talk about some of that today. So the first thing I think is we have to understand what border crossings look like along the U.S.-Mexico border, and they look radically different from what they look like along the U.S.-Canadian border. And I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A as well. I spent a lot of time in Detroit and in Blaine, Washington, when I taught at University of Washington, working with speaking with U.S. Border Patrol agents who are charged with guarding that northern border. So I'm happy to talk about surveillance and the different processes that go on in those two places. But along the U.S.-Mexico border, prior to the mid-1990s, border crossings were very public kinds of affairs, where you would just really, in broad daylight, you would see hundreds of people at different times amassing on the Mexican side of the border, hopping the fence, and then trying to run in to get past the border patrol. And typically people were fairly successful. If you get 100 people on the ground to hop the fence at once, and there's only 20 agents on the other side of the fence, a significant amount of people are going to get through and be able to blend in with the local population, hop in a car, and be driven off someplace else. This was going on for many, many years and became very politically unpopular, especially in the 90s. There was a huge rise in anti-immigrant sentiment that was coupled with a presidential election. And so when we have presidential elections in this country, the first thing that people do is attempt to demonize migrants in an attempt to better show themselves as, you know, political kinds of powerhouses. So this happens in the early 90s, and people start complaining about the visibility of border crossings. And so the Border Patrol decides to combat that they will just put hundreds of agents on the ground, and they will make it impossible to hop the fence in a place in an urban zone like San Diego or El Paso. And so suddenly people who would amass on the Mexican side of the wall and would hop the fence and get by the Border Patrol suddenly found that they were outnumbered, and they were being caught, and they were being sent immediately back to Mexico. So this starts to happen. People keep realizing that they can't cross in urban zones. So what they decide to do is, let's just walk or drive 20 miles east or west of this city. The border fence drops off. There's nobody there waiting for me. I can hop the fence, and then I can double back and get into the United States. That starts to happen. And what the Border Patrol realizes is that they can't necessarily stop border crossings, but they can funnel them away from these urban zones, and they make them less visible, and they can push people out into the middle of nowhere, such as the Sonoran Desert as pictured here. And as it starts to happen, they make two kind of key realizations. Number one is that they recognize that we don't have a border wall along most of the southern border because of the hostile terrain, because of the desolate and rugged terrain. So huge mountain ranges, vast deserts, places that are really hard to get across, and also places that are hard to maintain any kind of infrastructure. So they realize, like, hey, there are natural impediments on the ground, natural obstacles that people could potentially, you know, that people would struggle to get past. So just because if you walk 20 miles west of El Paso, now you've got to hike through the deserts of southern New Mexico. So they recognize, like, hey, this environment is difficult to get across. But more importantly, if we funnel people away from these urban zones, we can force them to walk across these barren, desolate landscapes where they can freeze to death in the winter, they can die of dehydration in the summer, where they have to walk 60 or 70 miles to get to a city and get picked up. That the natural environment then can suddenly become an asset to the Border Patrol. They can weaponize it against migrants. And, you know, the idea was they would force people over, quote, more hostile terrain as a way to slow down this process. And so this is what happens in the mid 90s. It becomes official in 1994 under this policy called prevention through deterrence. And it is the current security paradigm that exists now. But this paradigm now exists in places like Mexico. It exists in places like Australia. There are many places where we're trying to use the natural environment as a weapon against migrants to slow down their movement. But the U.S. really kind of invented this thing, and it's been co-opted by many other governments. We could think about folks dying in the northern United States trying to get to Canada, out in these vast, desolate, freezing areas where people are trying to walk or walk from Canada into the United States, vice versa. It's been happening in both ways, but there, nature is acting as an agent of the state. So we start doing this in the 90s, and we block off many of these urban zones, but we leave a place like southern Arizona relatively wide open. There's not a lot of border walls. There's not a lot of border security. This is a shot from a port of entry in southern Arizona that's about 3 miles from the legal port of entry, where if you walk west from that kiosk, the wall just stops and there's nobody there waiting to catch you. So you can literally walk right into the United States. But the problem is you now have to walk 60 or 70, 80, 100 miles to get to Tucson or to get to Phoenix. And instead of having this kind of vertical border wall, now you've got this horizontal landscape that acts as a deterrent. And so this is what prevention through deterrence is really trying to do, is to use this landscape to slow people down. We put it into place in the mid 1990s. A bunch of things start to happen in the US and Mexico that lead to a spike in out-migration from Latin America, including the North American Free Trade Agreement, which really crashes the Mexican economy in the 1990s by flooding that market with US subsidies like corn that farmers couldn't sell here, but it's much cheaper to make here than in Mexico, and it outcompetes all of these peasant farmers who now suddenly, they could grow corn before and take it to market, now they can't because of these US subsidies, so now they have to out-migrate. So hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people start to leave Mexico starting around 1996, 97, and they start coming through the Arizona desert. In previous years, Arizona, the entire state was averaging maybe 15 or 20 deaths along the entire US-Mexico border. And suddenly now the numbers start to rise, and you get hundreds of deaths that are happening in places like the Sonoran Desert. To date, actually, this number doesn't include the last 3 months, but we're now at about 3,800 recovered human remains in Arizona alone. And a lot of the forensic work that we've done in previous years suggests that bodies decompose so quickly in the desert that this number probably grossly underestimates the actual number of people who died. But the more important thing to think about from this graph's perspective is that fatalities are low prior to prevention through deterrence. They go into place, NAFTA happens, outmigration happens, people come to the United States through the Sonoran Desert of Arizona, and then suddenly a spike in migrant deaths begins to occur and stays relatively steady for decades. And actually in some places, it's gotten worse. In 2020, numbers were down for a variety of reasons, but migrant deaths were actually up. It was one of the deadliest years on record for Arizona alone. And so what we've seen is that even as migration has slowed, the crossing process has gotten more and more deadly as people are trying harder and harder to avoid the border patrol, and they're going deeper and deeper into the mountains and woods to get away. So there's a direct positive correlation between this policy and migrant death. And when you map out migrant death in Arizona, for me, this visually represents a humanitarian crisis. This horrible, catastrophic loss of life that many Americans are just completely ignorant of. And if this was happening anywhere else in the United States, I think people would call this a crisis. If these individuals were white individuals or white Americans, I think that this would also be considered a humanitarian crisis. But because these are brown bodies, because these are undocumented individuals, there's not a lot of attention paid to this. And a lot of my work has really tried to raise awareness about this issue through a variety of means. Writing of books and articles and other kinds of things, documentary films, and an increasing amount of exhibition work. Since 2019, I've been involved with an exhibition called Hostile Terrain 94, which is a participatory exhibition designed to raise awareness about migrant death along the US-Mexico border. It's a pretty simple concept. It involves the filling out of thousands of toe tags that represent information about individuals who have died along the US-Mexico border through Arizona. The orange tags, they represent unidentified individuals, which is about 1,400 right now in Tucson alone. And the manila tags represent individuals who have been named. What we do with these exhibitions is basically we work with hosting partners. They call us up and they say, we're interested in this. And we say, okay, we send them the kit with all of the toe tags, all of the information and the maps and the things that they need to build this. And then they mobilize their own communities, and they get hundreds, if not thousands, of people to sit down and to fill out toe tags and to construct these giant wall maps. They take these tags and they put them in the exact location of where those individuals were found. This is an exhibition that happened in the fall. This is at Mississippi State in Starksville, Mississippi. And in this video, what you're going to see are students and faculty and staff filling out toe tags and then constructing this wall map of Arizona.
Jason, are you, we're still on the first slide as far as I can see, is that?
Is it not, you're not seeing?
We're still seeing your opening.
Oh my God, really? I don't know why that is.
Shoot. Oh yeah, now it's moving.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I just showed like 15 slides.
Yeah.
Let me just, let me go back here then, and I'm not gonna, I promise I won't start this talk over. So sorry here. You're seeing all this though.
Yeah, now it's coming through.
Okay. Yeah. Many apologies. I've never had that happen. I'm not sure why it's doing that.
No, I don't know.
Okay, so let's just start with this map then. So I've talked about, these thousands of deaths that have happened along the US-Mexico border, and this is what it looks like when you try to visualize it, or when you map it out in Google Earth. And what I've been trying to do with recent work, exhibition work, is to raise awareness about this publicly through different mechanisms. And so we launched an exhibition in 2019, as I said, called Hostile Terrain 94, which involves the filling out of thousands of toe tags that represent individuals that have died while crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. And we get folks in different locations who organize their communities to build these things, to bring together hundreds, if not thousands, of volunteers, and then they construct these wall maps. So here is a time lapse of this show from from Mississippi State. And what you're seeing here, it's students and staff. They are filling out tags on the ground. They have laid out the grid that represents the exact location of where those individuals were found, and they are now mounting those tags in the exact location of where those remains were found. And this is a process that can take weeks. Some exhibitions that are going on, they do it over the course of many months. We've done it in a variety of different contexts. There's been about 50 shows that have happened so far, and there's probably about 25 shows that are happening at the moment. Really the idea is relatively simple. I wanted to take this two-dimensional map and make it into something that was living and breathing and three-dimensional, that represented or helped to connect to an audience in a better way the gravity of this amount of loss of life. And I think something really special happens when we ask volunteers to come to a space, to sit down and to write out the names of the dead. And for me, it becomes a way to memorialize these individuals, to remember this loss of life, but also as a way for folks to connect with this in a different kind of way. There's just something more personal, I think, about your own handwriting and your own, and contributing and collaborating with this, as opposed to going to an exhibition and just seeing this already kind of built. We launched this in 2019 through a series of prototypes. We predict now that probably by the end of this year, we'll probably get to about 120 shows. These shows are probably now going to go into 2024 at least. We're getting constant requests for new shows, but the idea is that anybody can host this that wants to. It's relatively simple to install. It's relatively cheap to host, and we've done it around the globe. We've done numerous shows in Europe. We've got shows coming up in Africa and Asia, and then we will launch our Latin American shows starting in the summer. And so if you're interested in that and getting involved, you can check out our website and learn more about how to potentially host Hostile Terrain 94. Like I said, we work with student groups, we work with church groups, universities, art galleries, anybody that has a wall and is interested in this issue. And I'll come back to that in towards the end. Okay, so I've given you some history about prevention through deterrence. Unfortunately, with not all of my interesting slides that would have illustrated that, but maybe you just in your mind you can visualize the desert. But now I'll give you some actual photos of the desert. These are two men that I got to know many years ago, that I write about, and who I call Memo and Lucho. These were people who were getting ready to cross the border into the United States through the Sonoran Desert. And on their last border crossing attempt, I gave them disposable cameras and had them document their experiences so that I could understand it and I could see it, and then so that they could also share their story with others. Memo and Lucho would tell you, if you were crossing the Sonoran Desert and you wanted to get to the United States, you typically begin in a place called Altar, which is in northern Mexico. Altar is a trucking town that focuses on produce and other things that are coming through, as well as a lot of drug smuggling and a lot of human smuggling. So many migrants show up in Altar to meet up with a smuggler. So much so to the point that the local baseball team, they're called the Coyotes of Altar, and in Spanish, coyote is a euphemism for human smuggler. So many of these folks, they just know where to go. They get to Altar, they meet up with their guide. That guide puts them into a van and will drive them to the U.S.-Mexico border, where they will then try to walk across the desert and try to get to a place like Tucson, which is way up here, the top of the map, about 70 miles north of the Mexican town of Nogales. But before people do that, they've got to get lots of equipment, so water bottles, hiking boots, backpacks, whatever things that they can afford, which is not much, and whatever they can stuff into a backpack to get them through the desert, which is also not much. So you could imagine a few cans of food, maybe some first aid equipment, extra pair of socks, and some extra clothing, and maybe 3-4 gallons of water. You can never carry enough water to get across this environment, especially in the summer. I mean, it's a brutal heat where many people die from lack of water, from hypothermia, from exposure. but also from having to deal with, a natural environment where everything has evolved to poke, scratch, inject you with venom. More rattlesnakes than anywhere in the Western Hemisphere is found in the Sonoran Desert. Incredibly treacherous terrain that people have to get across. Migrants are crossing the desert at night with no compass, with no map, with no flashlight. They're oftentimes wearing things like cheap sneakers. So there are many things that are working against them to get across this very difficult landscape. And when they do this, it kills a lot of people. Like I said, millions of people have gone through this and have been brutalized by it physically, and thousands of people have died and disappeared during the process. And we've done lots of forensic work, which I'm not going to get too into, about how quickly a body can decompose in this environment, but it's sometimes under a week. It's clear that migrants are dying in a lot of places where nobody is looking for them, where there's lots of things working against the counting and identification of migrant bodies. And I just want to return real quick to a map to kind of drive this point home. So if we come back to this death map here in Arizona, you'll see to the left of the screen, there's just a big open area where there's no red dots. And the implication is that nobody dies over there. But what I would point out is that that's a federal bombing range. And so volunteers who go out in the desert looking for migrants and for migrant remains, or hikers, hunters, and other folks who oftentimes are the ones who find migrant bodies, don't have access to that area. So there are big parts of this border where we think lots of people are dying, but unfortunately there's been little ability for folks to get in there to actually find those remains. So, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the southern United States, especially in southern Arizona, is a killing field where thousands of bodies have likely gone unrecovered and probably will never be recovered because they're destroyed so quickly. And so for the last part of this talk, I want to just focus kind of on a couple of stories about those individuals that don't make it. This has been going on for such a long time, and I think it's when I began this work in 2009, I was pretty shocked the first time I came across human remains in the desert. And the first time that happened, they were skeletonized human remains. It was we were out in the desert looking for an individual that someone I knew he had found part of a skeleton, and so we'd gone back out to look for this person's skull and and other elements that we thought would be helpful for identification. We ended up not finding the skull, but what we ended up finding was, a couple of teeth and a complete human arm, completely stripped of flesh, but just sticking out of a pair of rocks in the desert. And it was one of the most bizarre and troubling things that I'd ever seen. You don't expect to go out into nature and just see a human being who's been ripped apart and just out there exposed to the elements. But that in fact was what I was privy to quite early in this project. And as the project sort of developed, we had more and more in encounters with death. But but what I want to talk about today really is one that really stuck with me, and that I think has really shaped a lot of my work subsequently, and my interest in this subject matter. And so I'm going to tell a couple of stories here. The 8 of us stand around her in silent awe, and it's obvious that not everybody in the group that I'm with, this group of students, not everybody's seen a corpse before, because somebody asks me if she's really dead. She's lying face down in the dirt, and it appears that she's perished while attempting to get up a hill. To get to this point in the desert, she's easily walked over 40 miles. Rigor mortis has set in, and her fingers have started to curl. Her ankles are swollen to the point that it looks like her shoes are about to pop off. The back of her pants are stained with excrement and bubbling with copper-colored fluids that have been expelled from her body upon death. She's been dead only a few days and is in what forensic anthropologists would term early decomposition. What that means is gray to green discoloration of skin, some relatively flesh relatively fresh, but bloating, brown to black discoloration of arms and legs. But these descriptions that you get from these textbooks, they don't do justice to what bodies left out in the desert look like, smell like, or sound like. Nothing does. Against the quiet backdrop of the desert, you can hear the buzzing of flies laying eggs on her. There's also the steady hissing of intestinal gases that are escaping from her bloated and distended stomach. It sounds like a slow leaking tire. After several days in the sweltering desert heat, her body has begun to change. Her skin has started to blacken and mummify, and the bloating is starting to obscure some of her physical features. But while parts of her are starting to transform into unfamiliar shapes and colors, her striking jet black hair and the ponytail holder wrapped around her right wrist, these things hint at the person that she once was. I ask a student that I'm with to go get a blanket, and we cover her up. It makes those of us still alive feel better. High above us, turkey vultures are circling her corpse. And at this point, we had already been doing forensic experiments using pigs as proxies for human bodies in the desert to understand how quickly organisms of that size, mammals of that size, decompose. And what we were seeing prior to this moment was you could have 35 vultures at one time feeding on an animal and completely devouring and destroying a body within a matter of days. And so it's troubling that we find this individual, and then there are also turkey vultures there. I count at least 4 of them circling above, and I marvel at how quickly they've gotten to the scene. I try to ignore them and write down some notes because I don't know what to do with myself. I'm trying to play the role of the anthropologist, but it's difficult, and I'm trying to be the adult in the group because I'm the oldest person. I'm supposed to be in charge, and I don't really know what to do with this encounter with this person who's only been dead a few days. But I start taking notes. She's got no personal possessions with her other than a bottle of electrolyte fluids. She's laying face down on the ground. We take notes. I take some pictures. I call the police, and we go and sit under that tree and wait for the cops to show up. So it's me and a group of students who sit there. And the silence among us is so tense. But occasionally it's broken when a breeze comes through and rustles the branches of that tree. Out of the blue, someone in the group starts crying uncontrollably and has to be consoled immediately. Someone else is so angry that she has to walk off into the distance to be alone. And those vultures just keep circling overhead. These birds are simultaneously implicated in this complex human drama, but they're also oblivious to it. I mean, all these birds know is that we've interrupted their lunch plans. But I want to say something to this group of students that I'm with because I feel like that's my job as a professor, as the person leading this team, to try to help people make sense of this and maybe to try to make this death seem peaceful or dignified. But it's one of the dumbest ideas I've ever had because there's nothing you can say in this moment that does not sound contrived. It's almost impossible to know what to say other than to maybe want to scream. And it's a hard moment we sit there and we watch this body. We wait for the cops. It feels very undignified that this person has to die out here alone in the desert. But maybe that's the point. I think sometimes this is what prevention through deterrence looks like. This is what this policy is intended to do, to push people out into the desert, to stop them, and oftentimes to kill them. And this is an uncomfortable thing. But I think for all of us, we need to understand that this is what the reality looks like right now in places like the Sonoran Desert of Arizona, but also places like the Darien Gap in southern Panama, in the Sahara Desert, in the Mediterranean. Right, there were bodies decomposing in all of these places, the bodies of migrants, and there aren't enough witnesses, and there's not enough outrage about this. And I want to point out to my American fellow citizens is that. We don't need to go to third world countries to get full frontal views of the dead and dying, like Susan Sontag has argued. We can go to our own backyard and we can see bodies on the ground decomposing. The dead live here and we just tend to ignore them. Sitting there on that dusty afternoon with those students, waiting for the police to show up, which takes hours and hours, I finally blurt out, "At least we got to her before the vultures did." And that person that we found, her name was Carmita Maricela Zaguipuya. She was a 31-year-old mother of 3 from Cuenca, Ecuador, who left her family and her 3 children to try to make it to the United States so that she could better provide for them. She was abandoned by her smuggler after she became ill and was unable to continue walking. And Maricela likely died from a combination of hyperthermia and a pre-existing medical condition, kidney condition. But one of the things that Maricela said to her family right before she left Ecuador was, quote, "My kids are dying of hunger here. My kids are suffering. Whatever my destiny is, I must go." After finding Maricela's body, I made contact with her family in Ecuador and in New York. And one of the biggest themes of the conversations that we had revolved around the condition that her body was in when we found it. The family was very, very concerned that she had been eaten by animals. And so, I went to visit the family. This is her sister-in-law and best friend, Christina. And one of the reasons that they were so concerned about the condition of her body was because when they received her coffin, she'd been in the desert for 6 or 7 days, and then she was in cold storage in Arizona for almost a month, unembalmed. And so she had to be shipped back to Ecuador in a closed casket. And the medical examiner said to the family, "Please do not open this coffin." And so Christina says to me, "They said not to open the coffin, but we'd been planning to change her clothes when she got here for the funeral. We wanted her to look good for the funeral. We also wanted to be able to say goodbye to her. The children wanted to say goodbye to her. They said not to open the coffin, but we did anyway." And so what happened when they opened the coffin is the body was in a horrible state of condition. And also what the medical examiner didn't want to tell the family was that they had to remove her hands with a bandsaw so that they could rehydrate her fingers to fingerprint them, which is one of the techniques that they've actually developed a technique for fingerprinting bodies in Arizona because they've had to deal with so many desiccated corpses that now there's a whole new standard way of taking fingerprints, but it does involve removing the hands. And so, of course, when the family got the coffin, everybody wanted to see Maricela. They wanted to confirm that it was her. But Christina says that we opened the box and it was a mess. It didn't look like her. It was terrible. She said the children were screaming. They wanted to see their mother and to say goodbye. And the thing that they saw that was in that box was not their mother, but will stick with them for the rest of their lives. And, Christina, they really wanted me to bring photographs of the body. So I did. I brought pictures that we had taken to confirm that it in fact wasn't animals that had gotten to her, but it was just the fact that she had not been embalmed. But regardless, to see your loved one in that state of condition, I think was an incredibly traumatizing event for everyone involved, especially for the children. But Christina says to me, we don't believe that it's her because of the way she looked. But if it is her, we thank God because it's a miracle that we have her back. She says she's only half complete, but at least she came back. And if that is her, then it does help us to move forward. The children have a grave that they can go visit. There's a place that they can go to speak to their mother. But she says, it was just incredibly difficult to see her in this form, but we're lucky at least that we got something back. And, in a lot of ways, I think she's correct. Because there are a lot of families that have not gotten a body back. At Colibri right now, we're working on over 3,300 open missing persons reports, trying to find matches with the 1,300 unidentified bodies that are currently sitting in the medical examiner's office. And so there are a lot of families that don't have a coffin to bury, that don't have a grave to go visit. And I think perhaps that element of prevention through deterrence, the fact that it makes these bodies disappear, is one of the most troubling aspects of this whole thing. All of these orange toe tags representing the unidentified individuals really sticks with me and troubles me in ways that I oftentimes have a hard time articulating. And this is because of my own kind of firsthand experience with seeing how families deal with the disappearance of a loved one. Clinical psychologist Pauline Boss, she's got a phrase that she has coined called ambiguous loss. And it really just refers to when a family member disappears and you don't know if they're dead or alive, people are stuck in this perpetual state of mourning. They don't know, they're holding out hope that maybe that individual is still alive. Maybe they have amnesia. Maybe they've been kidnapped. There's always this possibility that they could come back, even if it's been many, many years. People who have been kidnapped, who have been murdered, we see this in a variety of different kinds of contexts. And Pauline Boss argues that it's the not knowing what has happened to these individuals that it really is crippling for these families. It paralyzes them and puts them into this frozen state of grief where they cannot begin to move forward and to even begin the process of closure, because they're never quite sure if the person that they're mourning is in fact dead. And after after we found Maricela's body and that whole story kind of unfolded, I really thought that that was going to be the worst thing that I was ever going to see in Arizona. And of course, I think things can always get worse. It was about a year after we found Maricela's body. I was sitting in the airport in Tucson, getting ready to come home after a summer of field work, when I got a text message from Christina saying, basically, we've got a family member who's disappeared. Can you come and help us find this individual? And so I got involved in this missing persons case with this family to try to figure out where this family member went missing, if we could go back in the desert and try to find them, and perhaps reunite them with their families. And so I went to New York and started interviewing people who had been with this person who was missing. And this is from one interview I did with a 13-year-old kid that I call Felipe. And he says to me, we were in the desert for 5 days and the water ran out. And my cousin Jose, he kept stopping to sit down and drink water. He was sick and his feet were hurting and he couldn't keep going. Finally, at about 6 o'clock in the morning, he fell down on the ground and couldn't get up. So the smuggler came over and started kicking him and saying, you need to get up or I'm going to beat you. But my cousin Jose couldn't go on any farther. He was dazed and sick. He said to leave him behind. So we gave him what little water we had left. We got him situated underneath a tree and we went to get help. And they were picked up by immigration agents just a couple of days later. The relative that they left behind was a 15-year-old kid named Jose Maria Tacuri. And when I started doing interviews with Jose's dad about where his son was and where we think he could have ended up, one of the things that his dad also really wanted to talk about was just why his son was in the desert. Why would someone risk their child's life? He really wanted me to understand what had happened. And so this is what he says to me. When I was in Ecuador, in Cuenca, my son Jose was my right hand. He was always with me. We were inseparable. But when I came to this country, he became a rebellious child. I would call my son and I would ask him, why have you changed? Because Jose was living with an elderly grandmother. He was out partying at all times of the night, largely, being acting like a wild, unsupervised teenager. And so his parents were becoming concerned. And so they asked him, why have you changed? And Jose's response to his dad was, no, Papi, I haven't changed. It's your fault. You left me. We were like brothers. You were my everything and you left me. It's your fault that I'm like this, he says. And his dad responds, well, I didn't come to New York because I wanted to. I came here because I wanted to get ahead, because in Ecuador, I can't give you the things that you need. I can't provide for you or your family or your siblings. And Jose has a disabled sister. So his dad says, I left when he was 10 years old to provide for him, but he didn't understand those things at the time. He just thought that we had abandoned him and he had changed from being such a good kid. But then all he would say to us was that if he could come to New York, that things would be better. But I said, you have everything in Ecuador. You finally have a nice house to live in. You've got new clothes. You've got internet in your house. But Jose would say to his parents that he just felt empty inside, that he would go home and his parents wouldn't be there. And that the only thing that would help to fill the emptiness that he felt inside of himself was to be reunited with his parents. So they decided, after 5 years of being away from their son, that they would let him come to the United States. And so they sent for him. And his dad says, the last time I spoke to my son, he said to me, Dad, I want to tell you something, but I'll do it when we're face to face. And his dad says, but no, if it's bothering you right now, just tell me. There's nothing you can't tell me right now. And Jose says, we'll do it face to face, like father and son. Because it had been 5 years since they'd seen each other face to face. 5 years since they'd hugged each other. 5 years since Jose's dad had kissed him, had done any of those things that just parents need to do to their children to let them know that they care and that they love them. And so Jose says, okay, we'll talk about it when I see you in person. And his dad tells me, but he never did get to tell me what that was. But I guess he had met a girl in Ecuador and they'd gone out for about 6 months. And they were together before he left. And she had gotten pregnant. And he wanted to know, I guess, if I would help him and his daughter. 3 months after Jose disappeared in the Sonoran Desert of Arizona, his daughter Maria Jose was born. And his dad says, that's one of my biggest regrets to this day, that I was never able to tell my son that I was going to support him and his daughter, that I was going to be able to take care of them. And, you know, I'm when this happened, you know, at the time, I had a child at the time. I had a young child when I had this conversation, and over the years, I think that this conversation for me has taken on more and more weight. I mean, and kind of one of the reasons that you know I've taken on the work with the Colibri Center for Human Rights is that I think as I've grown as a person, as I've worked with families of the missing, it's number one. I think if I ever need to put myself into a very dark place, I need to think about the worst things that could ever happen to me. They're not things that happen to me; they're things that happen to my own children. And I sort of understood that on a basic level when I first interacted with Jose's parents, and I've definitely come to understand it more and more as I've gotten older, as my children have gotten older. Because this particular day, sitting with Jose's dad, he gave me this look that I've never been able to shake, and it's just this look of utter despair, this tortured look of like I can't imagine a more broken kind of person, like the feeling that one must have to lose a child and not know what has happened to them. He gives me this look, and then he says to me, he says, I'm just trying to find anything that might help me understand what has happened to my son. He says, there's nothing that I can do to get the joy back until we know what has happened to him. Just to know something about my son, that's all that I want, he says. But then he says, I can't go down to the border and look for my own child. To lose him like this and not know what is happening, he's like, you feel helpless. He's like, it's going to make us cry for the rest of our lives. He says, every day that passes, we feel more and more out of control. And it feels like I'm losing some kind of a battle. But then he looks at me too, and he says, I try to wake up though every day with energy and to be positive and to say, today we're going to find him. Today we're going to find him. But then he says, it's difficult to live like this, these ups and downs of complete despair, and then trying to find some hope so that you can get up in the morning and face the day. But he says, it's really difficult to live like this, to know nothing. And then he just says, all I can hope is that someday I'll be reunited with Jose in one form or another. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. That was a compelling and powerful talk. It's really helped me to understand the scale and the intensity of the violence that these migrants are experiencing, but you've also helped bring forward some of the humanity of those people, and that is makes a huge difference. So we will now open it up for questions, and we certainly have some time for questions. And once again, if you do have a question, please post it through the Q&A feature, should be at the bottom of your screen. And just to give people a little time to maybe collect themselves and think of some questions, I'm going to ask just one or two questions that actually you suggested in your talk, because they were connecting to some things that might be of interest to some of our audience members here. One of them was, you did mention that you've had some experience with the Canadian border and Canadian-American border sort of migrations and surveillance and security sort of processes, and noting some of the differences and similarities. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I taught at the University of Washington for 2 years, and so I ended up spending time taking students up to the port of entry up near Blaine, and then also, I'd spent time in Detroit with agents and looking at what's happening, with the border with Windsor. It's a orders of magnitude bigger the surveillance machinery in the along the southern border than it is along the northern border. Many Border Patrol agents consider the Canadian detail to be like a retirement detail. All of the U.S. ones are a lot of the U.S. ones, especially in certain parts of rural Arizona, are considered like hardship details, where people go there, they get paid extra because they're living in remote areas, kinds of things. Every Border Patrol agent has to do a certain amount of time along the U.S.-Mexico border before they can be relocated someplace else. But a lot of the folks that I was working with who ended up in a place like Blaine or Detroit, just was a different kind of pace. You're not, you're maybe arresting 30 people a month in a place like Blaine, or detaining 30 people a month at the port of entry, as opposed to like Southern Arizona, where you're arresting 30 people an hour kind of thing. But also, that border, well, there was some funny differences. I mean, the drugs coming up from Mexico, it's marijuana, methamphetamines, heroin, and the joke is those drugs come up in big bales or in camouflage backpacks, and all of the pills that come from Canada come in through hockey bags. I mean, literally, they're like, it's the hockey bag from Canada, it's the bale of marijuana from Mexico, kind of thing. But there's a lot of I think there's a lot of people who live right on the Canadian border, who can kind of see into the United States, and not so much on the U.S. side, but there's definitely, like in Blaine, there's sort of more houses on the Canadian side, and they're heavily surveilled. I mean, the folks who live in those areas just have cameras on them at all times from the U.S. side, and so you'd go into one of these big technology rooms, and it's just walls and walls of cameras that are focused on people's homes, on their cars, and understanding who's coming, who lives where, who should be there, who should not be there. So I think many Canadians are actually under a significant amount of surveillance from the U.S. That they probably, those folks I'm sure know by now, but I think to many others it would be quite shocking to have to live under that kind of a microscope. But you also see that surveillance happening like with boats, and so on the Great Lakes, and the monitoring of those boats, and super fascinating stuff. I mean, most of the surveillance that happens along the Canadian border happens remotely. Whereas, in Arizona, you've got a lot of remote stuff happening, but you also have thousands of agents on the ground, where you're most likely to find agents in along the northern border sitting in a room looking at a computer screen and monitoring, a boat's trajectory. But yeah, it's a different kind of scary surveillance. But it's perhaps not as it's not as like physically brutal, but it's definitely more kind of Gattaca-esque, or like kind of scary technology being road tested up there. But we're also seeing it, increasing foot traffic between those two places, and people trying to get into the U.S. from Canada, and that's obviously proven deadly in recent months. So I think that even what we thought before as like a sort of innocuous, relatively safe kind of border, I think even the U.S. Canadian border is starting to become a different place than it was 10 years ago.
Right. Thank you. Okay, the questions are coming thick and fast now. So I'll start with just go in the order they've been received. The first one, the audience member has asked, isn't there a right to ask for asylum in the U.S. and to get access to a legal review before rejection? Hasn't the U.S. still not signed the Geneva Convention, which prohibits pushbacks at the border?
I don't think they have. I mean, I'm not surprised if they have not signed the Geneva Convention. I can't be for sure, but we definitely, the Remain in Mexico policy that Trump put into place is still in place now. And I think part of, and as ugly as that is, and as the false promises that was going to be taken away, and we were no longer going to force migrants to wait in these refugee camps, it's still happening. I think it is important that it is happening, because it highlights the fact that that this issue is bipartisan. That a lot of people want to blame Trump for the brutalization of migrants, and he brutalized migrants in new kinds of ways, but just really building on the things that Obama had been doing, that the Bush administration had been doing, and that the Clinton administration had been doing. But yeah, as far as I'm concerned, there's lots of human rights violations happening at the U.S.-Mexico border. And you get a lot of Americans saying things like, well, why don't these people just try to do this stuff legally? And thousands of people are trying to apply for asylum legally, and yet they are being put into this political limbo in Mexico, which, making them wait in Mexico is another form of deterrence, because we know if we say it's going to be 6 months for you to wait out this case, you have to live in a refugee camp. People are going to get, they get targeted by criminal organizations. They get frustrated. A lot of the folks who never wanted to try to cross the U.S.-Mexico border through the desert get stuck in a refugee camp because they're waiting on their asylum case, and then now they try to cross the border because we're forcing their hand. So yeah, it's a super ugly thing, and it's a really frustrating. I mean, the American public was really promised that all this stuff was going to go away right away, and it doesn't seem like there's any end in sight to some of this.
Right. And here's another question around legality. Is it legal for humanitarians, volunteers, or U.S. citizens to help migrants crossing the desert by providing them with water or first aid, or are there legal issues?
That's a great question. The jury has been in and out on that. As far as I know, and if you run into someone who's undocumented in the desert, you can give them water, you can give them food, you can let them use your cell phone, you can give them directions. The one thing you cannot do is put them in your car and further their physical journey. And so, like, in moments where, like, if we found someone in the desert who needed help, if we couldn't give them the first aid that they needed, and they needed to go to the hospital, which sometimes was like someone is so delirious and they don't know any better, and you have to make a decision that, like, you just have to go to, like, I know that you want to keep going, but you're going to die if we let you keep going, and so we're going to take you to the hospital. When we've had to do things like that, we call the Border Patrol and say, we have someone in the car, they're very sick, we're taking them to either to you or to a crossroad where you can bring an ambulance, kind of thing. And that's relatively okay. But there have been, there were some legal cases under Trump where, and prior to that too, humanitarian groups leaving water in the desert for, unseen migrants. People could come in and take that water as they pass through. There were folks being arrested for that and being charged with things like littering. A couple of years ago, there was a high-profile federal case where a group of humanitarians in Arizona were running a medical camp. And so basically people could come through and they would give them medical care, and then they would continue on their journey by themselves. The Border Patrol started raiding those camps and arresting people for harboring criminals. But those cases were all dismissed. So they've gone to some of the highest courts, and I think a lot of that was just really targeting by the previous administration. But for years, for decades, people were able to leave water and food without any legal issue.
Great, thank you. Here's a question from a third-year anthropology student who says they're just learning research skills, a question on methodology. Can you please talk about finding your writing voice? I was so taken with the images, but is it difficult to translate their meaning into words when those images are so powerful?
Yeah, so, I think the writing is, it's all kind of related. I mean, I think like the use of images, the use of writing, the storytelling, the narrative. I think one of the things that we don't teach anthropologists, or, I think social science researchers, is we don't teach them like the art of storytelling or the power of narrative, right? We teach people to write in a certain kind of way, which isn't always the best way to tell a compelling story. And, for me, it's this balance of, I want to be able to do rigorous social science. I want to be able to use multimedia. So photography has become increasingly important, and I'm working on a photography book right now. But also just, what's the best story that I can tell about the research that I've done? For me, working on the first book, if you look at the things that I wrote prior to that, my writing really evolved from I was a trained archaeologist for many years, and then I became an ethnographer, and then my writing started to evolve as I was becoming an ethnographer. And then with the first book, I'd written ethnographic stuff before that, but it really started to change, and I became much more interested in telling a compelling story. And I think the best approach to that is, number one, there's a lot of great ethnographies out there that I think that are superbly written, and people are trying to tell a story while at the same time educate you about these sort of complex issues. And so I think seeking out some of that work is great. And there's a lot of new work too on how we can write anthropology in different kinds of ways. But I also think that just as a student, the longer I was a graduate student, I think the more and more I hated reading, or at least reading for pleasure and reading the things that you spend all this time reading a lot of dry stuff that has information that you need, but it ends up really killing my love. It killed my love of reading for a long time. And when I started working on my first book, I got so frustrated with the writing process. I said, you know what? I'm going to go back to the basics. I want to just read things like novels that I haven't read. I hadn't read a novel in, it felt like, years. And so I went back and just for a long time, I just dove really deep into different kinds of writing that inspired me, especially the novel as a form of storytelling. I started working with storyboards and those kinds of things, and then I wanted to translate that back into anthropology. And I think that we can do that in all kinds of interesting ways, but part of it is just not maybe separating those two things out. I think you can be a wonderful storyteller, an amazing writer, and you can also be an amazing social scientist. We just need to encourage people to think about those things as being related. And a lot of times we're not giving you enough examples of the diversity of the types of approaches that can be used. But I think, yeah, if you're developing your research skills, there's no reason that you can't also just be a beautiful writer and just work on writing as a craft. Because I think when you do that too, people learn more about it and you're more inspired by it. I think, for me, as someone who hated writing as a graduate student, because felt like I was stuck in this pigeonhole for so long, and I hated the style that I was kind of stuck in, and especially within archaeology, I did not have a lot of flexibility to go outside of that mold. And when I finally did, I realized that actually, I love writing and I love reading and I love trying to translate these complex and powerful things into these different formats. And so I love the challenge of it. And I think, there's some great folks out there doing super cool stuff. It's just, you have to kind of go out there and look for it. And Carol McGranahan, there's a relatively recent, edited volume on writing anthropology that I think could be really helpful for students.
Oh, great. Thank you. So our next question is about the Trump administration. The Trump administration set in place many non-refoulement policies, such as the migrant protection protocols, which resulted in massive backlog of migration cases and long wait times for court hearings. How do you see these policies adding to the impact which deterrence policies already have on migrants arriving at the border?
I think it's all related. I think, when we say prevention through deterrence, I think some people just think, okay, that's the Arizona desert, or that's the South Texas backwoods. But there's so many other things that we can do to deter people, and prevention through deterrence. It kind of sounds like it's a nice thing, like it's a helpful sort of strategy. It's not that, it's not that bad. But it's really just trying to soften or to sanitize these different ways of just making people's life miserable in hopes that they will not try to come. There's a related thing. There was a program for a long time called the Alien Transfer and Exit Program, ATEP, and I wrote an article on this many years ago about how the Border Patrol, they would catch migrants in San Diego or El Paso, and then they would ship them individually to the Arizona desert or someplace else. They would they would send them someplace totally new on the Mexican side of the border, so they couldn't try to cross again. And their argument was, we're protecting migrants from their smugglers who would make them try to cross the border again. Even though people are paying these smugglers, they've worked hard to get a good smuggler that they can trust. Now the Border Patrol has separated them from that person, sent them to a new place where they don't know anybody, where now they may try to contract a smuggler that is completely unknown and is more likely to leave them in the middle of nowhere. But also we're relocating them to the desert, where now the path of least resistance is to go out into the desert as opposed to trying to hop the fence in San Diego. But it was pitched in such a way as this is us being nice. This is all for the protection of migrants. And even though it's a straight up preventative measure. And there's a lot of other things that we've done now that build on, the Wait in Mexico policy and everything else. I mean, Obama in 2014 launched this program called Plan Frontera Sur, which basically there was all these Central American kids that were showing up at the border. And Obama, and they're on the front page of the New York Times and all these other papers, and people are getting worried about these kids, and suddenly they just stop coming. And Obama says to the public, oh, we've taken care of it. We've secured the border. No, nothing to see here. But they didn't change anything at the border. Basically, what they did was they put all this pressure on Mexico to start this program so that they would stop the Central Americans before they got to the U.S.-Mexico border. So they said, look, fortify your border with Guatemala. We want to give you more agents on the ground. We want you to arrest more people and deport more people and make it impossible to make it so miserable to get across Mexico that they can't even attempt to cross in South Texas. Mexico sells this program to everyone as, oh, we're trying to protect people's human rights by being more present as immigration officers, by making sure that no one's going to get harassed or we're there for so they're not getting exploited. But it's a complete opposite. And my next book, my book I just finished, is about how prevention through deterrence really is this now extended to Mexico through this new program. And instead of, like, if you die in the Arizona desert, Border Patrol can say, we didn't kill you, the desert did. That's not our fault. Now, if you get murdered in Mexico because you've been targeted by the police or by immigration enforcement or by this increase in transnational gangs that know that migrants now need smugglers to get across these things and they're getting heavily exploited, if you get killed in that scenario, the U.S. can just say, well, Mexico, that's Mexico's problem. They did that. It's chaos down there. Even though we've got federal agents on the ground in Mexico training Mexican immigration agents. But all of this is disguised with this language of, deterrence and protection. And I think it's we need to really be interrogating that language and understanding that this stuff is all really connected. I mean, the same thing with like Australia, or think about the Mediterranean, where you have these boats that are out there floating across different political jurisdictions, and governments are ignoring those boats. They let them float around until they end up in someone else's jurisdiction because they don't want to deal with it. Maybe it's Italy or Spain, and so they're letting nature kind of take its course. And if those folks drown before some government takes ownership of that vessel, well, then that's nature's fault, or that's those individuals' faults for going out there. So we've been exploiting this stuff in different ways. And so I think prevention through deterrence now is a global strategy that allows governments to pretend that it's not their fault when people die.
Thank you. I think you've actually started to answer the next question. It says, Professor De Leon, as you mentioned, many migrants cross into Mexico from other Latin American countries before heading to the US-Mexico border. If you're able to speak to this, I'm wondering what kinds of impacts border externalization processes are having on migrant border crossing experiences.
Yeah, I mean, so my book I've just finished, Soldiers and Kings, really looks at how this new Mexican border and enforcement strategy has suddenly made it impossible to get across Mexico without a smuggler. So it used to be like if you were leaving Guatemala or Honduras, it could take you a month to get from the Guatemala border to the US-Mexico border. You'd hop on the train and you didn't have to pay anybody really. As soon as we started cracking down on that movement, all of these transnational gangs, MS-13, Bloods, and the Mexican cartels realized that they can start taxing these migrants who are also trying to avoid law enforcement. They can corner the market on smuggling. So the book that I've just finished is about all of these young men who are in transnational gangs like MS-13, who you've got folks who are leaving Honduras because of gang violence, and now they get to Mexico and they find that they have to contract another gangbanger to get them across the Mexico for a certain amount of money. And so we have made the entire length of Mexico a whole new kind of border wall to get across. And that's just Mexico. I mean, and you get the folks who are coming from further south. I mean, the Darien Gap, the folks who are coming from Haiti, from elsewhere, who are coming up through different parts of Latin America, are all facing new obstacles. And so it's there's just this growing. The border wall is just growing and growing and growing, and each one of these countries now is having to deal with it in different ways. I mean, I've never seen as many people congregated as I did in December when I was in southern Mexico and Chiapas. I mean, thousands of Haitians filling up a soccer stadium, waiting to get driven to processing centers. And those folks have been migrating for months, if not years, just to get to that point. So the process itself too is just extended, time-wise, by orders of magnitude.
Wow. Our next question actually is coming back to something you mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Person is asking, I was struck by when you mentioned at the beginning of the talk the disparity between the visibility of Ukrainian refugees and the planned invisibility of migrant deaths in the Sonoran Desert. Besides pointing out the hypocrisy, how can we as academics and activists mobilize this difference?
It's really tricky. because it's, you don't want to, I think one of the issues too is that you don't want to get into this like who suffers more kind of thing, which I think is, can happen. And so it's, even pointing it out sometimes I think can be really off-putting to people who would say, yeah, but you're missing the point right now. People are in Ukraine and they're getting bombed and they're getting killed, and of course that's the big issue, and then of course that is a big issue. I just feel like we tend to pick and choose when we recognize, human loss of life, or when we recognize like human suffering, and I think as academics, I think teaching students to be able to have those conversations in really nuanced ways is, I think, giving them a structure so that they can have a conversation that's not going to be, you don't want to get like, well, what about Mexico or what about Honduras? It really needs to be more like, let's think about this historically. Let's think about this from a variety of different frameworks, and then try to put things into perspective so that we can understand how it's all related. But that's a tricky one. I don't know. I mean, and it's really just for me. I think about it a lot. But it's been interesting to see the media lately trying to engage with it, because I just feel like for the longest time, academics, I mean, we've thought about this, like, which bodies count when someone dies. It's just been really interesting to see like big media outlets pointing out this hypocrisy as well. But I don't quite know where we need to take it next. Other than I think this is a really great time to have open conversations with folks about this. And because it's also figuring out like who needs to hear this, right? Who are the folks that, and I think part of it is like, I have friends and relatives who suddenly like want to open their hearts to the people of Ukraine, and it's like, why is his heart closed to everybody else? And I haven't quite figured out that. That's like the here in the United States, it's that uncomfortable Thanksgiving conversation that I stopped having during the Trump administration, because it just was like a screaming match with certain family members where we're just on radically different sides of the equation. But now it's a good time, I think, to try to open up this dialogue more. That's not a good answer, but I'm sorry, that's the because I'm working on that still myself. But I do think it's an important question to be putting to all of us.
Yeah, thank you. We still have time. We're not unfortunately going to get, there's a lot of questions. We're not going to get through all of them, but let's try a couple more. Our next one asks, I was wondering if you have anything to say about the relationship between the structures of elimination used against migrants and the settler colonial structures of elimination used against Indigenous peoples. I couldn't help but notice the parallels while reading your book.
Sorry, let me see if I can find that question so I can.
Further down.
Oh, okay, I see it. In many ways, they're closely related. Especially with like the Sonoran Desert issue for me. We never really hear about the Tohono O'odham people who occupy, their ancestral homeland is cut in half by the U.S.-Mexico border, and the bulk of people who die crossing through Arizona die on native land. And so you've got these indigenous folks who were marginalized by the federal government 100 years ago in this country, kind of locked into this place where they could no longer be as freely moving as they had been previously. It's one of the poorest reservations in the United States. It now also, this ancestral homeland that is a sacred space for that community has become a federal government, sort of killing field. The government, in similar ways, like, we're putting you on this reservation for your own protection, and now we're occupying your land with thousands of agents and vehicles and detention centers because we're protecting your land again as well. So there's a lot of like similar kind of processes, I think, that have been happening that just are new ways to, I think, to screw over indigenous people. But also, the fact that you've got so many like missing and murdered like indigenous women, both in the United States and in Canada, and this is this kind of invisible problem that people just don't seem to care much about because they're brown bodies, because they're indigenous bodies, because they're marginalized folks, and yet it's happening on this major scale. And it's really like these activists, and it's not really the federal governments that are putting attention to this, but it's the folks, the communities themselves, or researchers or other folks who are trying to point out these things. But there's so many parallels between whose lives are of value and whose are not. And I think that we need more coalition building around those kinds of issues. I mean, similar to the refugee thing, is like I think we need more refugees banding together to talk about this is not something that happens in a vacuum. And this is something that is going to continue to happen, and if we don't address it as a global issue, it's going to continue to perpetuate itself and just get worse and worse.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is asking about death. I'm wondering what death means to the various bodies involved. You have spoken to how you, your students, and the people you spoke with view it. I'm wondering how you think Border Patrol views death. Where, at what point do the bodies of undocumented migrants become viewed as less than others? At what point do undocumented migrants become an other to Border Patrol?
I think pretty early on that, the majority of Border Patrol agents are Latinos. And so you've got a lot of agents who come in, and to do their job, they have to already begin from the premise of like, these folks that I'm arresting or chasing, they look like me, they speak like me, they maybe come from the same countries that I come from, and maybe the same similar background, but I'm here legally and they are not, or I'm here legally now because some folks have naturalized, or maybe were undocumented before. But I think for a lot of the Border Patrol agents, they have to have that frame of mind in order to do the work. And there's people like Josiah Heyman, who he's written about brown, like Latinx Border Patrol agents, and how they have to, they're like certain conceptions, and it all revolves around nationality, where like the Border Patrol job is supposed to transcend issues of race, and it's really just about American versus non-American. So there's lots of othering that happens, and the agents that I've worked with on the ground, they'll say crazy things, and you're just shocked because they'll say things like, well, my parents came here illegally, but tough shit, I'm here now, and law is the law, and these folks are lawbreakers, and that's just how it's got to be. And I think they have to do that to justify the work. I mean, it's this total cognitive dissonance that they have about the work that they're doing. And then the othering really just happens in all kinds of ways. I mean, when we talk about we refer to like Central Americans as OTMs, other than Mexicans. So being able to call not even a migrant, but we've got 6 OTMs moving west, kind of thing. The language is already in place to make those agents think about individuals as not people. When you hear them on the radios talking about people moving across the landscape, they refer oftentimes to migrants as bodies, and so say we have 6 bodies moving east, blah 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 blah. So this really dehumanizing language, and it's funny. I think what really becomes interesting too is that like there's all this language of dehumanization that happens when these migrants are alive, but as soon as a border crosser dies, and they become a dead body, they cease to be the problem of the United States Border Patrol. So if you die in the Arizona desert, you don't call the Border Patrol. And if you do call the Border Patrol and say, I found a dead body, they call the sheriff's office. So the local police have to come out, and then they handle that. And so immediately upon death, even though the Border Patrol is, partly responsible for this individual's death, they can wipe their hands clean and say, now this becomes a state problem, and those individuals have to be dealt with by someone else. So yeah, even in death, they're sort of bodies while they're alive, and then they become a non-problem once those individuals cease to be breathing anymore.
Well, unfortunately, we have to stop there. Our Zoom technology, I think, will throw us out in a couple of minutes. So before we get thrown out, I just want to thank Dr. DeLeon again for such a compelling talk. And I want to thank everyone for coming out today and some of your great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to address all of them. And I hope we'll be able to consider or continue these conversations further around here at York, and continue to have these conversations with Dr. DeLeon and his incredible body of work. So thank you again, Jason. It's been really a pleasure. Cheers.
Thank you all so much. Take care.
Okay, take care. Good night.